Thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Charlotte Riggs. I'm the program coordinator for the Center for Connected Multimodal Mobility. And I am going to introduce Dr. Mashurani Chaudhry, our Center Director, who will introduce our guest speaker for today.
Thank you all. This is Ronnie Chaudhry. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Pam Murray-Tuite for our distinguished speak today. Here is a short bio of Dr. Murray-Tuite. Dr. Murray-Tuite is a professor in the Department of Civil Engineering at Clemson University. She has been involved in over 30 research projects sponsored by the Department of Defense, National Science Foundation, Virginia Center for Transportation Innovation and Research, National Institute of Health, Northern Virginia Transportation Commission, Virginia Tech Center for Community, Sustainability and Resilience, and University Transportation Centers, among others. Through these projects, Dr. Murray-Tuite and her graduate students investigate transit impacts, develop behavior models, and simulate transportation networks, and investigate ways to improve transportation operations for different conditions or situations. She specializes in unusual conditions in the transportation network or system, including evacuation and network and risk analysis. Her work often involves multidisciplinary efforts, striving to help bridge the gap between social science and transportation engineering, especially in the context of disasters and disruptions, as well as household decision-making. Dr. Murray-Tuite has 70 refereed journal publications, 1 book, and 3 book chapters. She has recently served as a member of Task Group 4, Community Planning and Response for NRC, Canada's Technical Committee on Wild Land Urban Interface Fire, and an external advisor to the European Union funded project titled Management of Weather Events in the Transportation System. She is the co-chair of the Transportation Research Board's Committee on Disaster Response, Emergency Evacuations, and Business Continuity. We are very fortunate to have Dr. Murray-Tuite talk to us today. Thank you, Dr. Murray-Tuite. It is our pleasure to have you in our distinguished speaker series today.
Thank you for that nice introduction, Ronnie. Our presentation today is called Sharing Self-Driving Autonomous Vehicles for Evacuation. This was a collaborative effort where the students did most of the work. So Thomas Shirley and Bhavya did a lot of the work, where Thomas did the survey side and Bhavya did the network simulation side. Other faculty involved here are Nathan Hune from USC, Gurjan Kumart from Benedict, another student of mine, Shen, and 2 students from Benedict College. So the context for sharing in here is a little bit different from what people have been using when they talk about the sharing economy. In this context, we're talking about people actually kind of loaning a self-driving autonomous vehicle rather than sharing a ride. So we want a distinction in the topic of what we're dealing with. So some of the motivation for our study is that we've seen a tremendous amount of hurricanes and flooding in the southeastern United States in the last several years, and it's only expected to get worse. Okay, and in addition to the climate events that are going on, we're also experiencing a rather large coastal population growth. At the same time, there's some changes in driving behavior, and there's also advances in technology that suggest that autonomous vehicles and self-driving vehicles will be available in the near future. However, we know relatively less about what they or how they can be used in these natural disaster situations. So we're seeking to explore that gap. And through a survey, we're going to be showing you the results of our study, which used information from South Carolina residents to determine the feasibility of sharing self-driving autonomous vehicles to aid in pre-impact evacuation, which means that we're getting the evacuation done before the hurricane, right? So this should help lessen the risk of a vehicle being damaged by the hazard itself. And during this process, we're also looking to address the questions of, how successful can we be in evacuating a critical transportation population, right? And they know that that's going to be affected by the public's willingness to share and the different market penetration levels, right? So we're seeking to see what kind of penetration level we need in order to be able to be 100% successful in using autonomous vehicles to move these households, as well as seeing how successful we can be if we have less than 100% market penetration. So when exactly we would have all these autonomous vehicles is unknown. There seems to be a wide variety of possible projections from the literature, right? And you can see that there's a lot of uncertainty, right? So somewhere between 25 and 87% by 2045 is one projection. Others have projected 40 to 60% for vehicle sales in the 2040s, and somewhere between 15 and 90% by 2050, right? And a lot of this is really depending on the price and how much people are willing to pay. So this leads us to consider, several different futures. Okay, so there's the case where there's been little adoption of autonomous vehicles. There's the private ownership. There's a purchase and share where people will buy the autonomous vehicle, but then share it as a common mode when they're not using it. And then there's the possibility of subscribing to a rideshare system that's based on autonomous vehicles. And there's also a possibility of microtransit, which would have passengers that are traveling to or from the same area being picked up by a service. We presented some of these futures to a focus group to see how well they understood the differences and how they could relate. And we found that there were some challenges in fully envisioning a purchase and share environment as well as a microtransit environment. So we ended up dropping those from consideration for the survey simply because it seemed like we weren't going to be able to get good results. Other important factors are, the magnitude of the need for helping households that don't have access to good vehicles, right? And South Carolina has a plan for helping these critical transportation need households evacuate. Their plan includes the location of shelters, right? These are the public shelters. That also has transportation that's going to be provided for them. And typically these are based on buses, either from state-owned school buses or city-owned buses. And they've also made estimates of the population that would need evacuation assistance. And in a worst case, like a Category 5 hurricane, this number approaches about 50,000 residents. So it gets to be quite substantial. Okay, so we do know that not everyone who needs a ride will have to get one from a government agency. They can get rides from people that they know, right? So other family members or friends. The challenge though is that there's some clusters of people who know people who are in similar situations, right? So there can be whole sections of people who don't have access to friends who have vehicles to help them, right? So that leaves them dependent on others. However, bus evacuation and public shelters are not preferred compared to being able to stay with friends and family members, or in a hotel or motel, or having a private vehicle transportation option. Right, so Wong et al. In 2018 suggested that this unpopularity of these public options could discourage people from evacuating. Okay, so then there's some good news, right? So after all the doom and gloom, here's some good things. Right? The sharing economy could provide some alternatives, right? And Wong's study, they looked at asking people to help out. So in their study, we have about 50% of people who would be willing to deviate and add travel time in order to assist others with evacuation, right? And also that there's some opportunities for providing free shelter as well. There's also been reports of companies like Uber and Lyft and Airbnb trying to help out with evacuation and disasters. And these include vouchers or so on from credits from Uber and Lyft in order to transport people to evacuation centers. Airbnb has an open homes program that will help hosts offer to evacuees for free, right? And there's even been mention of the possibility of using the sharing economy and Ubers and Lyft because of the COVID situation, right? Another major event that occurs during this time, right? So again, trying to spread out the distance between people as we go through these trying times. So what we did was we conducted these 3 focus groups that helped us narrow down both the futures and identify some of the concerns that they have that we could use in our survey overall to get a larger perspective on things people were concerned about and how willing they would be to share their vehicles. Okay, so we ended up developing a survey that contained questions in each of the categories that you see in these light green hexagons. Right, so we asked about their normal commuting and everyday travel habits. We asked them what kind of technology they currently have in their vehicles, how they feel about themselves being early adopters of technology relative to their peers. We asked about their participation in the sharing economy, and as well as general volunteering and giving, figuring that our context is very related to donations. And then their experience with natural disasters in general, and a few other things as well. Okay, overall, we were able to obtain over 1,000 responses. The scope of our survey was a bit broader than just evacuation. So to keep this, the time of the survey reasonable, we split our sample into 2 cases. One that dealt with evacuation and one that dealt with disaster relief. So the results that I'm showing you here today will be for the evacuation side. Okay, so the main question that we wanted to have a good feel for was, how willing would people be to share their personally owned autonomous vehicles for evacuation? Okay, and you can see the breakdown here. Starting from the upper right, we have 15% said that they would be extremely willing, with an additional 21% saying that they would be willing. And after that, it kind of breaks down into various categories, right? But you can see that between extremely willing and willing, we're nearly a third of or approximately a third of our sample said that they would be willing to share their self-driving autonomous vehicle. Okay, so we ended up thinking that 7 categories for modeling purposes was a bit too much, and that the difference between willing and extremely willing would be, a bit fuzzy. So we ended up combining extremely willing and willing into a single category, and we also combined unwilling and extremely unwilling into another category. So we ended up with 5 when we go on to our models that we'll show you later. Okay. We also asked about a lot of different factors that would possibly affect people's willingness to share their vehicles. And one of those was just a general, tell us which of these types of circumstances would affect your willingness. Okay, so not everyone indicated that there would be something that would change their willingness to share. But strength of storm was selected by 185 of our 525 respondents. If they had lived in the area previously, this seemed to influence their willingness to share, potentially because they have an attachment to that area. Definitely having friends and family, a step more in depth than just previously living in the area. That had a rather large effect. So people with friends and family are especially likely to share vehicles to help them evacuate. Okay, so that's all in line with general expectations. But then we also had the potential for their existing travel commitments to provide a constraint, right, at the time of actually being asked to share. All right, to break it down a little bit more in terms of the strength of the storm, what we can see is that the more severe the storm, the more people are willing to help out. Okay, so this helps because we're going to need to evacuate larger numbers of people from each of these increasingly numbered storms, right? So we'll get more sharing, but we also have more people that we have to evacuate. Okay. Other limitations that we inquired about were, how many days in advance of landfall would you be willing to donate or loan your vehicle? How long would you be willing to let your vehicle be away from you, right? And constraints on the time of day, days of the week. We also asked about, what people would expect in terms of compensation for loaning their vehicle. They also, our focus groups had indicated that it would be nice to be able to track the vehicle while it's away from the owner. And indeed, when we looked at the survey, there's still a substantial number of people who would like to be able to track their vehicle. And people even wanted to be able to travel with their vehicle, right? So they would be willing to help out, but they also wanted to maybe be the one accompanying the vehicle along the way. So to look at a few of these in greater detail, a lot of people were willing to let their vehicle be gone the entire day, right? So about a third of the people who answered this question would say that we could take the vehicle for the whole day. It's good to see that only 2% would only let it be gone for less than an hour, recognizing that, less than an hour probably isn't enough time to make a substantial impact on an evacuation unless it's very local. Okay. Then we also asked about how many consecutive days people would allow their vehicle to be gone, right? So for example, this might be like up to 4 hours on several days in a row. Okay, and so we see that this is kind of split up, and we picked a limit of 4 days because evacuations typically see the bulk of their evacuation in, 3 days or less before landfall. Okay, then in terms of what people would expect as compensation for being able to use their vehicle presumably this would be run by a government entity. They're looking for different things like tax incentives, the insurance to be taken care of, the cash compensation would be appreciated by many. They definitely want the energy costs to be covered. And even mileage would be appreciated by many. Right. So if we were to keep extending this from concept to more of a practical model, we'll have to take into consideration, what of these options we can offer. All right, so then we looked at all of our survey data and ended up developing an ordered logit model. Okay, so this identifies our variables that were associated with the willingness to share. And again, we had 5 different levels of willingness. Okay, so to see a little bit better the effects of all these variables, we can look at the marginal effects. Okay, and let's focus our discussion here on the willingness column, because this is what's going to be pulled out as those who are going to allow us to borrow their vehicles for the purposes of the evacuation. Whereas all of these other categories are nice for understanding how, how people are kind of feeling, but when we go to actually try and estimate how many vehicles will be available, we're going to focus on this last category here. All right, so we see that, being 65 or older, has 11% decrease on willingness to loan the vehicle. But being unemployed significantly increases this likelihood. Okay. The being involved with a religious practice or organization increases the willingness to share, as does having high comfort with autonomous vehicle deliveries in the next 5 years, and high comfort for sharing autonomous vehicles for income in the next 5 years. Right, so you can think of this group as being kind of a autonomous vehicle friendly group. And then there's also the question of, the experience with giving or donating during any disaster relief type of activity. And those who have that kind of experience are also more willing to donate their vehicles for temporary use. The one interesting thing, though, was related to having social media. We found that those who have low participation in social media, like having either 0 or only 1 social media account, are less likely to be highly willing to share their autonomous vehicles. Okay, so we took this model here with these estimates for the parameters associated with these variables, and we applied them to a synthetic population. So we generated this population using the package population sim, which takes as inputs the public use microdata sample, and we also used the American Community Survey. We generated 1,894,711 households, and we made sure that we generated all of the attributes that we needed for the model. From that application, then we were able to calculate the probability of each of those outcomes, meaning each of the levels of willingness. And from those probabilities, we determined the proportion that would be willing to share from each sub-county. So that left us, with an overall average over the sub-counties of about 32% being willing to share. Okay, and that was based on, again, on that highest level of willingness. Then we applied that percentage of willingness to share and multiplied that by the market penetration and the number of households in a sub-county to get an estimate of the number of autonomous vehicles that would be available. All of that input then went into kind of a simulation model where we're trying to figure out, what proportion of the population that needs help with their travel was able to obtain it. So from all of those vehicles that were available and, that we just calculated, we're going to then take also a look at the time a duration of time that the owners were willing to let their vehicle be away from them. Okay, so that serves as a constraint to the operations of this transportation. So from each of the centroids of the zones, we assume that that's where all of the vehicles will start and end from, and where the pickups for the evacuees will occur. We calculate the distance that is available for the autonomous vehicles based on, how long that they're allowed to be away from the owner. We pick one autonomous vehicle and we see if the distance that it has is sufficient to be able to evacuate the nearest critical transportation need household. If it's not, then we send it back to its origin. And if we have used all of the autonomous vehicles, then we go to the calculation phase of the covered demand ratio. If we haven't used them all yet, then we go back and we select another one. Okay. If we are able to transport a household, then we do so, and then we check whether all of those households have been served. Okay, again, if they have, then we're going to go to the calculations of the covered demand ratio. If not, we're going to, after delivering them at the shelter, we take this household and we bring it to the nearest shelter. And then we go and see if that same vehicle can make another trip, right? See if they can transport another household to a shelter. Okay, and we go through all this process until either we used up all of the vehicles and their time availability, or we evacuated everybody. Okay, so in applying that model and our availability of autonomous vehicles, we made a variety of assumptions. Right, some of those key assumptions here are that the autonomous vehicles are only available from the non-evacuation region. Right, so we're only taking these autonomous vehicles from the blue areas. Okay, so figuring that everybody who's in a red area is busy using their own vehicle because they'll be evacuating. We also assumed that at most households would donate one autonomous vehicle. Then each autonomous vehicle was assumed to only evacuate one household in a single trip. So here we didn't combine small households into a single vehicle. And we mentioned the centroid component. Okay, and then based on the South Carolina estimates, we assumed that 5% of the population in each evacuation zone would need assistance. And then we also made a simplifying assumption that the shelter capacity was unlimited. So that was not a limiting factor in this study. Okay, so the next component that we needed input on was what are reasonable market penetrations? Okay, so since our study was not about trying to predict the market penetration for autonomous vehicles in the future, we borrowed rates from Bonsall and Kuckelman's 2017 study. And those market penetration rates are provided here. And they provided years for which these rates could apply under different scenarios. And we picked these scenarios because they provided a lot of variation in the overall market penetration. So we felt this would give us a variety of penetration rates to work with. Okay, so we ran our simulation model 15 times for each of these 16 combinations. And what we came up with then were these rates of demand coverage. So you can see that the short term, we have in scenario one, about 58% we're able to reach. Okay, and in the best case, in scenario 8, with a 34% market penetration, we're able to get everyone evacuated who needed assistance. Okay, so one other thing to note is that when we try to fit these curves, we see about before we get to the 20% market penetration, we get a fairly linear increase in successful evacuations of their entire population needing help. After that, we get a kind of a diminishing return, as you can see that we're getting closer and closer to reaching 100%. But the most benefit that we get by increasing the market penetration is when we're at these lower levels. All right, so a few slides of conclusions here. When we are looking at the willingness to share these vehicles, we have several factors that decreased the willingness to share, and those included being on the older age group, having the lowest income group, not having very much activity in social media. On the other hand, factors that increased people's willingness to share were being unemployed, taking regular religious trips, being comfortable with autonomous vehicles in a 5-year time frame being used for deliveries, and for also being shared for income, and those who also have experience donating for disaster relief. When we applied our logit model to the synthetic population, we found that about 32% of households would be willing to share their autonomous vehicles. Okay, so we do recognize that this could be a little over enthusiasm in this, but it still gives us a basis for getting some ballpark figures. Then the other factors here, or the points to make, are that we have this fairly linear increase in being able to meet the demands when we're working with market penetrations up to about 20. And after that, we get the, less effectiveness. When the market penetration level had reached 30% or higher, we were able to meet all of the transportation needs for these households. Okay, so overall, we thought that this was all very promising, and that we do plan to extend this in the future. And some of those directions are coming up for other people who might want to look into this as well. But first, just recognize that we know this wasn't a perfect study. It's a preliminary study that looks into a new approach to transportation for evacuation purposes. We acknowledge that, again, there could be over-enthusiasm for this alternative, and people's willingness may not work out as well as it was suggested in this study. We also acknowledge that we used our current population, even though some of these market penetrations are really for future populations. So there could be changing demographics and population characteristics in the future. We also used some simplifying assumptions about the travel speeds when we were figuring out, how many trips an autonomous vehicle could accomplish during the time that the owner was willing for it to be away from home. And those were that we had 20 miles per hour occurring during the day and 40 miles per hour occurring during the night. We had also assumed that the bulk of evacuations would occur during the day, which is consistent with literature, which shows a dominant preference for travel during daylight hours. We also assumed that one autonomous vehicle could evacuate an entire household, and we also didn't allow sharing of an autonomous vehicle by 2 evacuating households at the same time. All right, so future studies overall will look into extending this idea into a true application. Then other studies could use the same survey we're willing to share in order to see how well this applies to other states. And so, for example, we tend to think of the South as being very friendly. So maybe the donation willingness will change from state to state. That's something worth investigating. We also think that the future surveys could explore the limitations on sharing a bit more, right? So the other thing about the survey is we only asked about the sharing component. We didn't ask people about whether they'd be willing to accept this ride. Okay. And another direction that could take place is we could look at the different ownership scenarios and incorporate the system into larger evacuation simulations. So this study was generously funded by C2M2, but the content is solely the responsibility of the authors, and the federal government assumes no liability. And here's the set of references. So I guess I'll see if there are questions.
Hi. Yeah, so please, if you speak up if you have any question, or you can also write your question in the chat box, please.
How did it account for communications?
Hi, Denise, I see you in the audience. So do you have any question or any comment? Because it was funded by US DOT and you are our contract manager. So if you have any question, we'll appreciate it, or comment.
So I'll address Jill Sorensen's question. So at this point, we did not deal with the communications component to it. So that is definitely something that would go into the next step into these studies that we have planned for the future. So this was just to get an idea of how willing people would be to share it. While the details of working out such a system we left for hopeful future funding. And does the return to the residence after an emergency factor into our study? So when we were talking about, whether they had enough time to complete a pickup at the evacuation zone and drop off at the shelter, we also considered in that time how long it would take to get back to the owner, so that the trip from the owner to the evacuee and from the shelter back to the owner were all part of that time consideration.
Charlotte, say any question in the chat box?
Yes, so we have a question from Carol Jones, and she's asked, what studies have been conducted to facilitate the sharing of commercial fleet vehicles, hotel delivery companies, other companies?
So Carol, I'm not entirely clear on what you mean by the commercial fleet vehicles for hotels. Do you mean like the hotels sending their shuttles to pick people up?
She says yes, shuttles, potentially future autonomous, sorry.
Okay, I don't know what has been done about these shuttles. I don't know, Stephen Wong is online and he's done some similar work. Do you know anything about hotel shuttles, Stephen?
In terms of hotel shuttles, I can't think of any specific study on using them in an evacuation. But conceivably, they are a fleet that could be easily automated. and could be useful. So it's definitely in the realm of possibility and something that might not be used, and that could actually be used in evacuation.
So there's different studies though in general that have looked at trying to optimize the use of delivery by autonomous vehicles, and so on. So if you want to drop me your email, I can send you some titles and so on.
And she further elaborated that the thought is that sharing might be easier if it's not a privately owned vehicle.
Yes, and that actually was one of the futures that we had that we're still looking at the model for when although it's not exactly the context that you're presenting here, we had looked at the subscription service and asked people, how much delay would you be willing to tolerate, in case the owners of those vehicles were going to provide some of their fleet to the evacuation operations. And so from that perspective, we should have a model really soon. But so it's similar, but not quite the exact question that you're asking.
Okay.
But in that case, it is not privately owned as well.
We have an additional question from Stephen Wong. He says that they had also found an interesting connection between sharing willingness and past assistance, along with trust/compassion, elements of social capital, and higher risk in the hazard. And he says he's curious about your thoughts on how the characteristics of the receiver might affect the willingness of the provider to share. And also, what do you envision as the policy structure for this in the future? Like who operates/runs it?
Those are some good questions to think about as we go forward in trying to build this out for real. So I see trust being a major consideration, especially among people that you might not know. So for that reason, a lot of the compensation characteristics or desires, I think, are going to be key components. And so, if things are fully insured by, say, a government entity or someone taking responsibility for operating the system, then they would probably help, right? So if it's going to be fixed, that might be reasonable. But I think this also reflects back on, the factors that influence people's willingness to share. For, we saw that, having a connection to the area is certainly influential in their thought process, right, about how willing they would be. So yeah, I think that will be something to explore in greater depth as we go forward. Who would operate it or run it? It would have to be an official entity. Because in my mind, someone that, like an emergency management agency that could take responsibility, who would have an idea of a full perspective of the shelters and where people are who need assistance and so on. So that's who I think could run such a system.
Okay, we have a question from Saqib Khan, and his question is that the preference of vehicle sharing may also get affected by the management authority who will coordinate the overall evacuation, considering multiple private companies operating segregated fleets. And he wants to know if you have any thoughts about that.
So I think that it would be, worth testing out if we should have a completely centralized system that can coordinate among different private companies to make sure that nobody gets left out, right? And that we have some equity in providing these types of rights and assistance. So Saqib, is that what you're looking for?
Yes, Dr. Pam, and I think like you also discussed the same question in one of the previous comments. So thanks for your answer.
Then we have another question from Denise, and she's asked, would pickups of residents include multiple locations, and would vehicles be programmed to drop off at specific shelters?
So our current simulation model takes the residents to their closest shelter, right? So we did not include multiple stops along the way. It was a strictly one household from one location and bring them to one specific shelter. So we did have different shelters that were open, but it was all based on proximity for this particular study. But we can certainly extend that in the future.
And she had an additional question. Are the level 4 vehicles defined as the fully autonomous, or?
This is the lowest level that is self-driving.
Mm-hmm.
So I think level 5 is probably even better. But yeah, this was the first level that didn't require a driver fully in control.
Probably level 3, level 3.
Level 3.
Yeah. Level 3, yeah.
Thanks, Ronnie.
Between level 3 and 4, yeah.
All right, and design and survey.
I don't see any more questions in the chat, but feel free if you have a question to send it, or you can unmute and ask directly.
Hey, Pam, it's Steven again. I have a quick question on how do you think that this would change based on the type of hazard? So thinking about the difference between a hurricane versus a more localized flood versus a fast approaching wildfire. Just your initial thoughts on that would be really great to hear.
All right, so I tried to keep it as, kind of the safest use of somebody else's property in this case. And we had, started the process for evacuation nice and early, right? So this would be different from these shorter notice events where you have less time to get the vehicle back home before impact. So I imagine that there would be some greater reluctance to send your vehicle into an active hazard zone. So the good news though about some of the other events is they're not necessarily as widespread of an impact zone as, as a hurricane, where we often have, see like 100 miles or more being covered by the hazard. So I think, or traveling, at least 100 miles. So I think that helps. But you do have a good point. How would this be affected by active hazards? And I don't think that we would get as enthusiastic participation in those situations.
A question from Catherine Hayes.
Yes.
Yeah, so Catherine asks, was there any consideration of data that would be collected during the autonomous trip? And if yes, were survey respondents concerned about privacy issues in data collection?
Okay, so we did not ask our survey respondents about data collection privacy issues. I think it might affect those who are being picked up as well. All right, so if we start the trip from the centroid, we can at least separate that trip from the exact location of the home on either end. So, I think it depends on, exactly how that would work from the management's perspective. But we did not ask them at this point. There were so many questions, and I think we revised this survey like 20 times, trying to cut it in half each time. So this was one of the issues that we cut in the process of getting down to what would be somewhat reasonable in length. It was still really long. And that is one of the reasons that we had to split our survey sample in half between disaster relief and the evacuation scenarios. It was too long and nobody would answer all of our questions.
Any questions from the students? I see many students are in the audience today. So it was, this project was the basis for a master's thesis, right, Pam?
Correct.
Thomas Charlie, I think he did his master on this C2M2 project.
Yeah, and he worked really hard. He did so much of this work that it was, phenomenal how much he was able to accomplish.
He was a great student at Clemson.
Agreed, 100%.
Pam, I have one more question. And this is very, I guess, random, but what are your thoughts on trying to pair this with any type of, I guess, logistics system, right? So you're bringing AVs in and then it'll take someone out, but that, trip is an empty trip on the way in. And so do you have any thoughts on that? That just popped in my head. Thought you might have some ideas on that.
So I think there's two things to think about in that respect. So the first is that you want to keep your relief supplies out of the out of harm's way in the the staging. You want to stage at least a certain distance away so that whatever you're going to bring in is not destroyed by the hazard. So there could definitely be the possibility of joining some of what you're saying, considering that these are empty trips, with somebody else's question about multiple stops. Right? You could have them bringing supplies from further out in the state to a staging area on their way to going to pick up the evacuating household. But if we're doing this in a staging way, then if there's a shortage of trucks, that could make sense. But if there's no concern about trucks being damaged or so on, they may be able to handle that transport of large amounts of materials to that staging area. But your comment about how could we more efficiently use the trip into the area is a good one, and we're gonna have to look thought into what we could do with that.
If there is no other question, then I think we can end it here. But it was great. So, Dimitra, do you have
Thank
any
you all
questions?
for attending.
Thank you. thank you. It was great. So we enjoyed it very much. Thank you so much. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you.